All right, moving on to the next topic. We're going to be breaking down a team that I really don't talk about. Me and my co-hosts really don't talk about on this podcast, and that team is the Utah Jazz. But they're going to get a lot of attention today in this next segment. So moving on to the next topic, with Quinn Snyder stepping down as the Utah Jazz head coach, are the Utah Jazz on the verge of a rebuild? So I'm not gonna say I like the Utah Jazz, but I've grown a lot of respect for this franchise over the last few years, and I'm gonna get to the reason why I do believe they are on the verge of a rebuild. So the question to that is, yes, they are on the verge of a rebuild. I believe this roster has honestly reached its peak over the last 3 years, being contenders in the Western Conference. I believe this roster has a lot of pieces that they can trade. I'm going to name a lot of role players that are in their 30s or higher in their careers. You have a point guard and Mike Conley at age 34. You have Jordan Clarkson at the age of 30, who just won Sixth Man of the Year not too long ago. You have Bogdanovich, who is 33 years old, who tore his ACL earlier in the year, earlier in the season, in January. He'll be coming back from a torn ACL next year. Rudy Gay, still in the league. It's 35 years old. So those four role players, I think, could set up. If you trade all four of these role players, I think it could be great. You could get a lot of acquisitions. Starting a rebuild of the Utah Jazz. Obviously, these four players I just named have a lot left in the tank. I think Mike Conley is still one of the great veteran point guards in this league. Jordan Clarkson is obviously one of the best bench players in this league. Bogdanovich is one of the best three-point shooters in this league when he's on his game. And Rudy Gay can still contribute for any team, any contending team in the league. So all four of these players, I think, can be effective role players elsewhere in the league. And I think if you're going to start an automatic rebuild this summer for the Utah Jazz, you start off by trading these four players. But I think the real reason why the Utah Jazz are on the verge of a rebuild is because when you lose a head coach as effective and as smart as Quinn Snyder was for this Utah Jazz team, who brought them up from basically nothing and turned them into a contending team, a contending franchise in the Western Conference, I think that's a huge loss for the franchise. I think that's a huge loss if you lose a head coach like that. If you're a contending team anywhere in the NBA, you have a lot of question marks. And it wasn't like he was fired. He stepped down from the position. So that worries you if you're a Utah Jazz fan. That worries you if you're in the front office for the Utah Jazz. Quinn Snyder helped so much for this Utah Jazz franchise to become, I wouldn't say elite, but contenders in the West. Have obviously been one of the best teams in the West over the last few years. He has helped this franchise win 372 total wins, and that's including in the postseason over the last 8 seasons. So when you lose a guy like that, I don't care how good you are, it's going to affect the franchise in a huge way. But this franchise, unfortunately, can never get over the hump. Their last few years in the Western Conference have been, they had 3 promising years, I should say, in the Western Conference, but can never get over the hump. You go back to the bubble where they lost in Game 7 to the Denver Nuggets when Jamal Murray and Donovan Mitchell were going toe-to-toe back and forth in that franchise. They got eliminated in the first round in Game 7. You go into the next year when they're competing against the Los Angeles Clippers and Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, who Kawhi Leonard got hurt during this series and could not continue, and his season came to an end, and we haven't seen Kawhi Leonard since, unfortunately, but I do believe he is going to be back and healthy next year. But moving back on track, they had the Los Angeles Clippers on the ropes, and it was just Paul George by himself, and PG-13 doesn't normally show up in the playoffs, but for whatever reason, he showed up in a big way to help the Clippers move past the Utah Jazz in that series last year. And the Utah Jazz failed to capitalize on the Clippers not having Kawhi Leonard, and failed on an opportunity to meet the Phoenix Suns last year in the Western Conference Finals. And then you go in and this year, you have everything you need into the playoffs. You have a healthy Donovan Mitchell. You have a healthy Rudy Gobert. You have Quinn Snyder, who has the playoff experience now in his bag. You have all these role players I just named, besides Bogdanovich. You still have Mike Conley, you still have Rudy Gay, you still have Jordan Clarkson in your arsenal, and you could not get past the Dallas Mavericks in the first round, who did not have Luka Doncic in the first 2 games of this series. So that's huge for me. That's 3 blown opportunities in the Western Conference. I will give them a pass for losing the bubble Game 7 to the Denver Nuggets because they did go on to win. Go on to the Western Conference Finals to play the Los Angeles Lakers. But I'm not giving you a pass for failing to get past the Los Angeles Clippers without Kawhi Leonard, and you're going up against a guy who has never shown up in the postseason in PG-13 and Paul George. As great of a player as he is, he never shows up in the postseason, but showed up in that series and helped them get to the Western Conference Finals. And I'm not giving you a pass for not getting past the Dallas Mavericks because the Dallas Mavericks only had Luka Doncic really as the only key superstar in the series. And the Jazz are one of the best shooting teams in the league and are a really good team defensively. So I'm not giving them a pass this year. And what I have come to this conclusion about the Utah Jazz, it pains me to say it, but I'm going to have to bring my Dallas Cowboys into it. They are the Dallas Cowboys of the NBA. The Utah Jazz just remind me of the Dallas Cowboys so much. You have all this talent. You have playoff experience under your belt. And then when it's time to shine, at least to get to the conference finals, you fail and disappoint your franchise every single year. And I think they are the Dallas Cowboys of the NBA. I hate to say it, and that's coming out of a Cowboys fan's mouth. But it'll be, like I said, it'll be hard for the Utah Jazz to replace Quinn Snyder because of how good of a coach he is. Now, there are reports that came out this morning that Chris Quinn, if you guys don't know who he is, the assistant head coach of the Miami Heat, obviously helped Eric Spoelstra, Udonis Haslem in a big way, coaching up this Miami Heat roster this year and helping them get to the Eastern Conference Finals. He's been around with the Miami Heat franchise for quite some time, and he's set to have an interview with this Utah Jazz team. Could he be the next head coach for the Utah Jazz? It'll be interesting to see. Time will tell if he is, but is he really good enough to help this team not go into a rebuild? I think if you get a guy like that, you trade those role players like I just said, and you go in with a young assistant head coach who knows the playoff experience. He's been in the NBA Finals with Eric Spoelstra in the bubble. He knows what it takes for franchises to get over the hump. I think you bring him in, a young guy, and get young players to help this Utah Jazz team grow and just rebuild because they're not going to get over the hump, and I'm going to explain why. So the reason why they won't get over the hump is the 2 star players that they have together. I think they've reached their peak together. I think Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert have reached their peak together. Donovan Mitchell, I think right now is the 2.0 version of Dwayne Wade. I think he's a really outstanding shooting guard. And then on the other hand, I do call Rudy Gobert overrated at times on the defensive end because he can't be lazy. But he is a defensive specimen that is a former defensive player of the year. He is one of the best defensive players in the league. So these 2 players you would think would be a dynamic duo running a pick and roll offense dominating in this league. But unfortunately that has not happened because they have failed on 3 separate occasions over the last 3 seasons when they were contending teams in the West to get over the hump and at least get to a conference finals appearance. I think this duo knows they can't win together anymore. I think the world knows that this duo can't win together anymore. So it's time to split them up. And both were disappointing this postseason in the first round against the Dallas Mavericks, who, again, they should have got past. I don't care if you had to beat them in Game 6, Game 7. You should have got past them. There's no excuse for that. Both were disappointing this postseason. Donovan Mitchell only shot 39% from the field. Gobert not giving 100% effort on the defense, both ends on the floor, offensively and defensively. Both disappointments, and both are blame and the reason why they did not even get past the Dallas Mavericks in the first round of the playoffs. So I think this Jazz team has no choice but to trade one of them this summer. I think you get more value trading Donovan Mitchell because, like I said, he is one of the great shooting guards in this league. I think he is the 2.0 version of Dwayne Wade. I like the market that could be set for Donovan Mitchell over Rudy Gobert. I think Rudy Gobert could be traded, but I think you get more assets, more first-round picks, and more players with trading Donovan Mitchell over Rudy Gobert. I think a trade package that I've seen Bleacher Report put together was and I discussed this last week. I said I would go ahead and trade Tyler Hero on a first-round pick for Donovan Mitchell to come to the Miami Heat and put him in the Heat culture. But Bleacher Report came out with a trade earlier in the week that I believe they had Tyler Hero, Duncan Robinson, It was another player. It might have been Max Strus or another player. I apologize if I'm wrong, but those three players in a first round pick for Donovan Mitchell. I think that's a fair trade. I think that's a fair trade for the Utah Jazz to start a rebuild. Meanwhile, on the other hand, I talked about it weeks ago. Could you imagine Luka Doncic with a big man that is capable of dominating offensively and defensively of a player of Rudy Gobert running the pick and roll offense with him? Could you imagine the Dallas Mavericks getting Rudy Gobert and teaming him up with Luka Doncic? A lot of players in this league that play, a lot of franchises that play in this league play a lot of small ball that could really benefit from getting a Rudy Gobert with their franchise. So both of them are very valuable if they hit the trade market this summer. I think you just get more value out of Donovan Mitchell than Rudy Gobert. But regardless, I think one of these players are going to get traded during the summer. I think Donovan Mitchell, the top two teams I can see him getting traded to at the moment is the New York Knicks or the Miami Heat. I think if he gets traded to the New York Knicks, it really doesn't make a difference because they don't have enough depth. You trade him to the Miami Heat and give Jimmy Butler another perimeter player, they have a chance to get to the finals next year. But regardless, I think the Jazz don't make the playoffs. If you trade one of them this summer, I think if Donovan Mitchell is still on the roster, Rudy Gobert is not on the roster, and vice versa, they're not getting to the. They could get into the play-in tournament, but I don't think they will get into the playoffs next year because, again, the West is going to be loaded next year. You're going to have the Golden State Warriors who are going to be contending for quite some time. That trio, that dynasty is not dying down, whether they win it all this year or not. They're going to be contenders next year. You can't count out the Memphis Grizzlies, who are young. I think they're going to add some key pieces this summer to help John Morant continue to compete in the West. You have, let's see here. This is, oh yeah, I'm eliminating the Phoenix Suns. That's why I'm still thinking. But the Los Angeles Lakers, can you really keep them out of contention now because their intentions are still bright? I think you getting a new head coach, you run it back with LeBron James, Anthony Davis, and Russell Westbrook. You see what you get this year. I'm not counting out the Los Angeles Clippers for being contenders in the West because they get Paul George and Kawhi Leonard back. The West is just going to be tough next year. And I just don't see the Jazz getting to the playoffs without Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell both being in a Utah Jazz uniform next year. So if they're not both going to be there, start a rebuild and do it quickly if you're the Utah Jazz franchise.